In the quiet hours of the evening, when the body seeks rest and the mind drifts into that gentle space between wakefulness and sleep, it is possible to let history flow like a calming river. Tonight, we will follow that river through the long centuries of Japan's warrior age, from its earliest samurai beginnings to the threshold of the modern world. This is the story of the predecessors of Emperor Meiji, the last great transition between the samurai-dominated feudal past and the new dawn of modern Japan. The figure of Emperor Meiji himself, born in 1852 and enthroned in 1867, often receives the focus of historical narratives because his reign coincided with the rapid transformation of Japan into an industrial, modern nation-state. But what is often overlooked in the rush to marvel at railways, telegraphs, and constitutional reforms is the deep and winding heritage that preceded his time. The samurai class, which shaped Japan's identity for nearly 700 years, formed the bedrock upon which Meiji's world rested. The shoguns and daimyo, the castles and sword-bearing retainers, and the codes of loyalty and honor, all these existed as a living framework that Meiji both inherited and dismantled. To understand the magnitude of Meiji's role, one must first trace the entire arc of the samurai themselves. These warriors, whose earliest echoes appeared during the Heian period in the 8th and 9th centuries, were originally provincial guards and mounted archers. Over time, they became far more than fighters. They became administrators, landholders, and a social class bound by both privilege and obligation. Their very name, samurai, comes from the verb saburao, meaning to serve. Thus, from the beginning, they were defined not solely by combat, but by service to a higher order. We begin in the quiet rice fields of early Japan, where imperial authority was ceremonial, and local clans, called uji, commanded men with bows and swords to defend their boundaries. The countryside, with its mist-covered mountains and fertile plains, offered both sustenance and the conditions for conflict. Out of these landscapes emerged warriors who became indispensable to local governors. By the 10th century, the figure of the mounted warrior, armed with longbow and later the curved sword, had crystallized into a recognizable archetype. The early samurai clans, like the Minamoto and Taira, learned to balance the courtly refinement of Kyoto with the stern discipline of life on campaign. When we picture the samurai, we might imagine their elegant armor, lacquered and layered, or their solemn ceremonies of loyalty. Yet just as vital were the less visible aspects: the bonds of family lineage, the careful distribution of rice harvests, the enduring ties of lord and vassal. This feudal system, similar in some respects to medieval Europe, was not born all at once, but took shape through centuries of trial and conflict. Each successive age brought new refinements to the social order. From the Genpei War of the late 12th century, which elevated the Minamoto and gave rise to the first shogunate, to the long centuries of civil war in the 15th and 16th, the samurai remained central. As we drift through these centuries together, our attention rests not only on the battles and names recorded in chronicles, but also on the texture of everyday life. Imagine the clatter of sandals on wooden floors within a daimyo's castle, the hushed voices of retainers waiting in a great hall, the faint smell of ink as clerks record land grants and obligations. Picture the tranquil gardens where a warrior poet contemplates the fleeting bloom of cherry blossoms, aware that life itself is as brief and brilliant. In such imagery lies the paradox of the samurai, fierce in war, yet deeply attuned to beauty and impermanence. The predecessors of Emperor Meiji lived through eras that seemed unchanging and eternal. Yet in retrospect, we see them as fragile stepping stones toward transformation. The Ashikaga shoguns, who presided over Kyoto while the country fractured, never imagined that centuries later, power would return to the emperor's hands. The Tokugawa shoguns, who forged a stable peace from 1603 to 1868, built a society of hierarchy and control, yet their very success created the conditions for their undoing. When Western ships appeared on Japan's shores in the mid-19th century, bringing demands for trade and diplomacy, it was the samurai who felt the strain most keenly. Their swords, once the symbol of honor, could not answer the cannons of the foreign powers. And so, we will move gently through these chapters, pausing at the rise of the samurai, the flowering of their culture, the devastation of civil wars, and the long, quiet order of Tokugawa Peace. we will see how codes of conduct like Bushido, the way of the warrior, emerged not only as ideals, but also as responses to the challenges of life in a rigid hierarchy. We will reflect on the stories of betrayal and loyalty, of concubines and queens, of poets and generals. All threads intertwine into the tapestry that Meiji inherited. As this story unfolds, remember that we are not racing toward the climax of modernity. Instead, we linger in the details, in the flow of centuries, as one might stroll through a tranquil garden at dusk. For sleep learning, this approach allows the mind to absorb, to rest, and to awaken with a gentle sense of continuity. By the time we arrive at Meiji's era, we will understand not only the dramatic reforms, but also the long twilight that preceded them. The samurai predecessors were not merely figures of the past. They were the guardians of an age whose memory still colors Japan today. Let us begin then with the earliest samurai, born from the lands and conflicts of the Heian period, where noble courts and provincial warriors together forged the path that would lead, eventually, to Meiji's reign. The origins of the samurai lie in the soil of Japan's earliest feudal landscapes, when the island nation was still in the process of defining what authority, loyalty, and service meant. During the Heian period, which lasted from the late 8th century to the 12th, the imperial court in Kyoto radiated refinement and ceremony. Court nobles dressed in layered silk robes composed poetry beneath the moon and considered military matters too coarse for their elegant world. Yet beyond the capital's gardens and palaces stretched a vast countryside of rice fields, mountain passes, and coastal plains. It was in these provinces, far from Kyoto's perfumed air, that the warrior class began to take shape. The early samurai were not yet the fully realized swordsmen of later centuries. They were mounted archers, skilled in the art of the bow, and their primary role was defense. Local aristocrats and governors, appointed by the court but often far removed from its daily oversight, relied upon these men to protect fields, collect taxes, and suppress banditry. Japan's landscape, marked by dense forests and narrow valleys, made small-scale conflicts common. A single band of horsemen could dominate a district, and so the need for disciplined, loyal retainers grew steadily. As we drift gently through this era, it is worth pausing to imagine the soundscape of early samurai life. The creak of leather harnesses on horses, the whistle of arrows in practice fields, the low murmur of men around evening fires. Daily duties alternated between the rustic and the martial, overseeing rice planting, building defensive stockades, and preparing for sudden raids. This blending of agrarian stability with constant readiness for combat shaped the warrior identity from the very beginning. The name samurai itself derives from the verb saburao, meaning to serve. Service was at the heart of their existence, not only to a distant emperor, but more directly to a local clan leader or provincial magnate. Loyalty was measured not in abstract ideals, but in concrete acts, defending one's lord's fields, escorting his messengers, and shedding blood when necessary. Over time, these bonds of loyalty hardened into hereditary ties, with warriors binding their families to lords across generations. Thus, a new social order was quietly emerging, one that would one day eclipse the authority of the Kyoto court. In the 9th and 10th centuries, as the central government weakened, powerful families like the Fujiwara dominated politics in the capital, leaving provincial administration to military men. The Fujiwara themselves remained refined courtiers, but they depended upon distant relatives and allies to enforce their will in the provinces. This gave rise to two great lineages of warriors, the Taira and the Minamoto. Both traced their descent to imperial princes, but both lived far from court, growing into military houses whose swords would one day determine the fate of the nation. The first chronicles of samurai deeds, poems, war tales, and diaries, reveal a mixture of elegance and brutality. Warriors recited verses about the fleeting dew on morning grass, then rode into battle to test their skill in single combat. Combat in this age was often ritualized. A warrior would announce his name, family, and lineage before charging, so that his deeds might be remembered with honor. It was a world balanced precariously between culture and violence, between the aesthetic ideals of Kyoto and the harsh necessities of the frontier. Daily life for these early samurai families reflected this balance. Homes were built of wood and thatch, sturdy against the elements, but lacking the grandeur of the capital. Women of samurai households often managed estates, kept records, and sometimes even took up arms when their holdings were threatened. Children learned to ride horses and shoot arrows from a young age, for the rhythms of war and defense touched every generation. The sword, though later symbolic, was not yet central. At this time, the longbow remained the weapon most admired. As the centuries passed, the court's weakness deepened. Tax revenues dwindled, local governors grew semi-independent, and the emperor's decrees carried less weight. Yet even as the political authority of the imperial household waned, its cultural prestige remained immense. Samurai families continued to look toward Kyoto as the font of legitimacy. A title bestowed by the court, even if purchased or symbolic, carried great honor. This created a paradox. While the court was politically fragile, it remained spiritually and ceremonially vital. The samurai thus lived in two worlds, rooted in their provincial realities, but tethered to the idealized authority of the emperor. We might imagine, then, a scene at the close of a Heian day. In a remote manner, a samurai lord sits before a low table, reading a scroll copied from a Kyoto poem anthology. Outside, his retainers train in the courtyard, their voices carrying through the evening air. The lord reflects on the fleeting beauty of the cherry blossoms overhead, even as he sharpens his bow for the battles that tomorrow may bring. This is the paradoxical calm that defines the origins of the samurai, both guardians of the fields and harbingers of war. By the end of the Heian period, these warriors were no longer simply provincial servants. They had become indispensable to Japan's political fabric. When disputes over succession shook the imperial court, it was the swords of the samurai clans, the Minamoto and the Taira, that determined outcomes. Their rise foreshadowed the shift from court-centered rule to warrior-dominated government. The dawn of the samurai was also the twilight of the purely courtly age. As we rest here, at the threshold of the 12th century, the samurai stand poised to claim a destiny beyond the provinces. Their bows and horses have brought them recognition, their loyalty has made them essential, and their growing power whispers of a future where warriors, not courtiers, guide Japan's fate. The rise of the Minamoto clan marks one of the pivotal turning points in Japan's long history, a moment when the samurai transformed from provincial guardians into rulers of the realm. As the 12th century advanced, the imperial court in Kyoto was racked by factional disputes, and the great military houses of the provinces, the Minamoto and the Taira, were drawn into the center of politics. Out of these struggles emerged the Genpei War, a conflict whose resonance still echoes through literature, art, and memory. In its outcome, Japan gained not only a new ruling order, but also the framework of the first shogunate, a system of warrior governance that endured for centuries. The Minamoto, also known as the Genji, traced their lineage to the imperial family. They were descendants of Emperor Seiwa in the 9th century, and thus carried the aura of noble blood, even though they lived and fought far from Kyoto's palaces. Their rivals, the Taira, or Heiki, claimed descent from Emperor Kanmu. Both families occupied similar roles. They were provincial governors, military strongmen, and leaders of networks of warrior vassals. Their rivalry was not one of simple opposition. Rather, both clans were deeply entwined with the fortunes of the imperial court, which often sought to play them against one another. The story of their struggle is preserved most vividly in the tale of the Heiki, a war epic recited for centuries by blind monks who played the biwa, a stringed instrument whose mournful tones suited the tale's themes of impermanence and loss. The epic begins with the famous line, "The sound of the Jion Shoja bells echoes the impermanence of all things." This phrase captures the Buddhist sensibility that underpinned the era, that all glory fades, all power crumbles, and life itself is but a transient blossom. Yet before that fading, the warriors of the Minamoto and Taira would blaze brightly across the land. The Genpei War, fought from 1180 to 1185, was more than a contest between two clans. It was a struggle for the soul of Japan's governance. The Taira, under the formidable Taira no Kiyomori, had risen to unprecedented heights by marrying their daughters into the imperial family, securing regencies, and effectively dominating the court. Yet their dominance bred resentment among rival warriors and courtiers alike. When an imperial prince called for rebellion, the Minamoto rallied behind him. The resulting conflict stretched across the archipelago, with castles besieged, provinces ravaged, and families torn apart. Daily life for the samurai during these years was marked by both hardship and honor. Imagine a Minamoto warrior on campaign. His armor lacquered but weather-worn, his bowstring taut, his rice rations scarce. Nights spent beneath open skies alternated with sudden clashes by riverbanks and bridges. Each battle was an opportunity for glory, and warriors were eager to proclaim their names and lineages before charging, ensuring that future generations would know of their valor. Yet alongside these moments of bravery came hunger, exhaustion, and the grief of seeing comrades fall. The war was as much endurance as it was brilliance. One of the most celebrated episodes of the conflict is the Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185, a naval clash fought in the swirling currents of the inland sea. Here, the Minamoto, led by Minamoto no Yoshitsune, defeated the Taira in a battle that symbolized the passing of an age. As the Taira fleet faltered, the young child Emperor Antoku, only 6 years old and carried by his grandmother, drowned in the sea rather than fall into enemy hands. The image of court ladies casting themselves into the waves, clutching sacred treasures, remains etched into Japan's collective imagination. With victory secured, the Minamoto established a new form of rule. Minamoto no Yoritomo, elder brother of the brilliant Yoshitsune, founded the Kamakura shogunate. Rather than attempting to dominate the Kyoto court directly, Yoritomo established his base in the east, in Kamakura, far from the intrigues of the old capital. From there, he created a system of military governance, appointing stewards and constables to oversee provinces and enforce order. The emperor remained as a sacred figure, but real authority now rested with the shogun, the supreme military commander. This shift had profound implications for daily life across Japan. For samurai families, the rise of the shogunate meant greater recognition of their roles as landholders and administrators. Loyalty to the shogun became a central virtue, and service to one's lord was codified in systems of land tenure and reward. Castles grew sturdier, villages more structured, and the relationship between warrior and farmer deepened. For the common people, the change may have seemed distant, yet its effects were felt in new forms of taxation, justice, and protection. Yet even in victory, the Minamoto experienced the fragility of power. Yoritomo, wary of rivals, turned against his own brother Yoshitsune, whose brilliance had secured their triumph. Yoshitsune fled, pursued by his own kin, and eventually met a tragic end. His story, immortalized in countless plays and legends, embodies the tension between loyalty and suspicion that haunted warrior politics. Thus, from the very beginning, the samurai age was shaped by both triumph and betrayal. As we reflect on the rise of the Minamoto, we see how the samurai evolved from provincial fighters into a ruling class. Their victories reshaped Japan's political map, creating institutions that lasted for centuries. Yet their stories, told through epic poetry and whispered in fireside tales, remind us of the fragility of power, the impermanence of glory, and the deep currents of loyalty and loss. As the Gion bells remind us, all power fades in time. But in that fading lies a story worth remembering. As we drift further into Japan's medieval centuries, we arrive in the Muromachi period, a time defined by the Ashikaga shogunate and the gradual fracturing of central authority. This era, spanning from the 14th to the late 16th century, reveals both the brilliance and the fragility of samurai rule. The Ashikaga clan, successors to the Kamakura system, brought new cultural achievements and connections to the imperial court. Yet they never commanded the same firm grip on the provinces as the Minamoto had once tried to maintain. Instead, the Muromachi centuries became an age of shifting alliances, noble rivalries, and growing instability, a fertile ground for both artistic flowering and political turmoil. The Ashikaga shogunate began with Ashikaga Takauji, a warrior who rose during the civil conflicts of the early 14th century. When Emperor Go-Daigo attempted to restore direct imperial rule in what is remembered as the Kemu Restoration, it was Takauji who first supported him and then turned against him. Takauji's betrayal reshaped history. By defeating the emperor's forces and establishing his own line of military rulers in 1338, he set the pattern for centuries of warrior dominance. Yet unlike the Kamakura regime, based in the east, the Ashikaga chose to rule from Kyoto itself. Their government was centered in the Muromachi district of the capital, which gave the period its name. At first glance, this seemed to reunite the warrior class with the splendor of the imperial court. Ashikaga shoguns built grand mansions and patronized refined arts. Under their watch, new cultural practices flourished. The tea ceremony began its long evolution. Zen Buddhism infused aesthetics with simplicity, and ink painting reached new heights. The Silver Pavilion, constructed by Ashikaga Yoshimasa, still stands as a symbol of this delicate blending of warrior rule and artistic patronage. For samurai families, the courtly values of Kyoto once again became a measure of prestige, even as their swords ensured their survival. Yet beneath this veneer of elegance lay chronic instability. The Ashikaga shoguns never enjoyed unchallenged power. They relied heavily on alliances with powerful provincial lords, daimyo, whose loyalty was often uncertain. As regional warriors grew more independent, the shogunate's authority weakened. The court itself remained divided, with rival imperial lines in the north and south claiming legitimacy. These divisions created conditions for almost constant conflict, where allegiance could shift with the fortunes of battle. To imagine daily life during this period, let us step into a provincial castle town. Wooden gates open into courtyards, bustling with retainers, farmers arriving with tribute rice, and scribes tallying accounts. Samurai households manage not only their martial duties, but also the governance of villages, forests, and waterways. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer mingles with the chanting of monks, while children practice with wooden swords in courtyards. For commoners, survival depends on the balance of power among rival lords, and the uncertainty of war is part of everyday existence. The 15th century brought further chaos with the Onin War, a devastating conflict that erupted in Kyoto in 1467. Ostensibly a dispute over succession to the shogunate, the war soon spiraled into a nationwide struggle as powerful daimyo chose sides. For more than a decade, Kyoto burned, and its once magnificent streets fell into ruin. Mansions collapsed, gardens were abandoned, and even temples bore the scars of battle. The war's effects rippled outward, weakening central authority so profoundly that the country entered what historians call the Sengoku, or Warring States, period. Still, even in this age of strife, culture continued to thrive. The tea ceremony grew into a refined ritual, offering moments of quiet reflection amid turmoil. Gardens were designed with an emphasis on simplicity and contemplation, their raked gravel and carefully placed stones inviting meditative calm. Theater traditions such as No reached new maturity, with masked actors presenting dramas of ghosts, warriors, and tragic loves before audiences of nobles and samurai alike. In these practices, the Japanese spirit found resilience, discovering beauty in impermanence and grace in restraint. For the warriors themselves, the Muromachi era reinforced the paradox of their existence. They were both destroyers and patrons, both agents of war and protectors of art. Loyalty became fragile, shifting with circumstance, yet ideals of honor continued to guide conduct. Betrayals were common, but so too were acts of fierce devotion. Samurai poetry of the age reflects this duality. Verses written before battle speak of both the fleeting dew of life and the enduring name earned through valor. The Ashikaga shogunate survived on paper until the late 16th century, but by then its influence had dwindled to little more than ceremonial recognition. The real power belonged to regional warlords who carved out domains and commanded vast armies of retainers. The Muromachi shoguns, once the heirs of Kamakura authority, became shadows in their own capital, presiding over a fractured land. As we pause here, at the edge of the Sengoku age, the legacy of the Ashikaga remains complex. They left behind gardens and temples that continue to inspire, yet their inability to bind the nation together opened the door to centuries of war. Their rule was a fragile bridge between the early rise of the samurai and the fierce contests of the warring states. In their twilight, we see both the promise of warrior culture and the seeds of its most violent expression. We now drift gently into the most turbulent centuries of Japan's medieval story, the Sengoku period, known also as the Age of Warring States. Lasting from the late 15th century into the late 16th, this was a time when the old bonds of loyalty shattered and the archipelago became a patchwork of feuding domains. The word Sengoku itself carries a resonance of unrest, echoing the Chinese term for their own warring states centuries before. For Japan, it was an age when every castle, every valley, and every river crossing could become a battlefield. Yet, even amid the chaos, seeds of unity were quietly being sown, preparing the way for the great unifiers who would emerge. The origins of this period lay in the decline of Ashikaga power after the Onin War, which left Kyoto devastated and the shogunate's authority nearly extinguished. Without a strong central government, daimyo, powerful regional lords, rose in prominence. They commanded armies of samurai and ashigaru, the common foot soldiers who now formed the bulk of fighting forces. Unlike the ritualized duels of earlier wars, Sengoku battles involved massed formations, strategic fortifications, and protracted campaigns. The very nature of warfare changed, becoming more organized, more brutal, and more decisive. Daily life for a samurai family in this period was marked by constant readiness. A warrior might be called at any moment to march, leaving behind his household and fields. Castles, once modest hill forts, evolved into grand stone structures with multiple baileys, high walls, and moats. Within their walls, blacksmiths forged weapons, carpenters reinforced defenses, and women oversaw both household management and, in times of siege, the defense itself. Villagers in the countryside paid heavy taxes in rice and labor to support these armies, while living with the fear that rival warlords might arrive to claim their allegiance by force. The Sengoku era was also a crucible for new strategies and technologies. Firearms, introduced by Portuguese traders in 1543, transformed warfare. The arquebus, though slow to reload, gave even common soldiers the ability to strike down armored samurai from a distance. Forward-thinking daimyo quickly adopted these weapons, reorganizing their armies to make use of volleys of gunfire combined with traditional archery and cavalry. The clash of swords and bows was now joined by the thunder of gunpowder. Among the countless warlords who vied for power, some stand out as emblematic of the age. Takeda Shingen of Kai Province became legendary for his cavalry tactics, his red-armored horsemen charging with fearsome precision. His rival, Uesugi Kenshin of Echigo, was celebrated as the Dragon of Ikigo, both for his martial skill and his devotion to the Buddhist god of war, Bishamonten. The two fought a series of epic battles, most famously at Kawanakajima, where armies clashed in spectacular but indecisive contests. Their rivalry, remembered with respect on both sides, illustrates the mixture of honor and ambition that defined Sengoku warriors. Yet alongside these grand struggles, betrayal was constant. Alliances shifted with the winds of fortune, and samurai often found themselves fighting former allies. To survive, daimyo employed not only martial skill, but also cunning diplomacy and occasional treachery. Marriage alliances were brokered, hostages exchanged, and castles handed over in return for promises of safety. A lord's fate could turn overnight, and many who once commanded provinces ended their lives in obscurity or sudden downfall. Still, the Sengoku years were not solely about destruction. They also saw growth in castle towns, where merchants and artisans flourished under the patronage of warlords. Markets expanded, roads improved, and trade with foreign ships brought goods such as silk, guns, and new foods, like the sweet potato. Christian missionaries, arriving with European traders, converted some daimyo and villagers, introducing unfamiliar teachings alongside the familiar rhythms of Buddhism and Shinto. Thus, even in the midst of civil war, cultural exchange and economic vitality quietly enriched the land. For those living through the Sengoku period, the uncertainty of tomorrow was a constant companion. Yet out of this restless age came remarkable resilience. Peasant families continued planting rice in the shadow of battles. Artisans crafted tea bowls and ink paintings that carried forward Zen simplicity. Monks kept their temples alive, offering prayers for peace in a time that seemed far from peaceful. The cycle of planting, harvesting, and worship persisted, reminding us that daily life endured even when armies marched across the fields. As we allow this period to settle in our thoughts, it becomes clear that the Sengoku age was both destructive and creative. It fractured Japan into countless warring domains, yet it forged a generation of leaders and innovations that would eventually reunify the land. The fires of conflict shaped men of ambition and vision, who in the coming decades would seek to end the cycle of endless war. The age of warring states was not the end of samurai Japan, but rather its fiercest testing ground, a proving stage upon which the great unifiers would soon step. As we move onward through the mists of history, we encounter three figures whose names resound above all others in the tapestry of samurai Japan: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. These three men, each with their own temperament and vision, succeeded in ending the long chaos of the Sengoku period and setting Japan on the path to unity. They are remembered together as the Unifiers of Japan, their lives forming a sequence of ambition, strategy, and legacy. To understand the world that Emperor Meiji would inherit centuries later, we must pause here to reflect on how these men reshaped the country from endless war into ordered rule. Oda Nobunaga, the first of the three, was a daimyo of Owari Province, born in 1534. At first glance, he seemed an unlikely unifier, eccentric in manner, blunt in speech, and given to unconventional acts. Yet it was precisely these traits that enabled him to rise above his rivals. Nobunaga recognized that the age demanded boldness. He embraced the use of firearms at a time when many still clung to bows and swords. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, his disciplined lines of arc devastated the famous Takeda cavalry, proving once and for all that modern tactics could eclipse even the most storied warriors. Daily life under Nobunaga's campaigns was harsh but transformative. He broke the power of militant Buddhist monasteries, which had long maintained independent armies, thereby clearing the way for centralized rule. He encouraged commerce, building castle towns that attracted merchants and artisans. In his strongholds, markets thrived and artisans found new patrons, even as the countryside reeled from constant campaigns. Nobunaga's reign was a storm, disruptive and relentless, yet also opening pathways for new forms of governance. After Nobunaga's dramatic death in 1582, betrayed by his general Akechi Mitsuhide, power passed to one of his most talented lieutenants, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Born in 1537 to a humble peasant family, Hideyoshi's rise was nothing short of extraordinary. He began as a sandal-bearer in Nobunaga's service, but through brilliance, adaptability, and relentless energy, he ascended to lead armies and inherit his master's mantle. His life became a symbol of social mobility within the otherwise rigid samurai order. Hideyoshi's accomplishments extended beyond the battlefield. He completed the process of unification, subduing rival daimyo through a combination of military campaigns and shrewd diplomacy. He instituted a survey of landholdings, ensuring more efficient taxation and control. Most significantly, he imposed a strict separation between warrior and peasant classes, forbidding farmers from bearing arms. This sword hunt, as it was called, consolidated samurai identity and bound them more firmly to their lords. It also meant that the peasantry, though bound to the soil, could live with a measure of stability. Life in Hideyoshi's time reflected this consolidation. Castle towns flourished, becoming hubs of both military administration and cultural life. Artisans produced lacquerware, textiles, and weapons for expanding markets. No theater and tea ceremony received renewed patronage, blending martial discipline with aesthetic refinement. Hideyoshi himself was a lover of grand display, commissioning castles with golden ornamentation and hosting banquets of extraordinary scale. Yet, he was also capable of ruthless ambition, launching invasions of Korea in the 1590s in an attempt to extend his rule abroad. These campaigns strained resources and brought little gain, revealing the limits of his power. After Hideyoshi's death in 1598, the question of succession once again unsettled the land. Into this uncertainty stepped Tokugawa Ieyasu, born in 1543, a patient strategist who had long bided his time. Ieyasu emerged victorious at the decisive Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, where his coalition defeated rival forces in one of the largest battles ever fought on Japanese soil. 3 years later, he was appointed shogun, marking the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate, which would endure for more than 2.5 centuries. Ieyasu's genius lay not in dramatic conquest, but in careful stability. He reorganized the daimyo system, requiring lords to maintain residences in Edo, modern Tokyo, and to alternate their time between their domains and the capital. This Sankin-Kotai system both drained the resources of the daimyo and ensured their loyalty, as their families were often left in Edo as hostages. Ieyasu and his successors cultivated a balance of power, ensuring that no single lord could challenge the shogunate's supremacy. For the people of Japan, this transition meant a gradual end to constant war. Villages could plant rice without fear of armies sweeping through each season. Merchants gained security for trade routes, allowing a growing urban culture to flourish. Samurai, once accustomed to battlefield service, became bureaucrats and administrators, still carrying swords but increasingly serving in roles of governance. In Edo, castle-town life grew vibrant, with theaters, bookshops, and markets buzzing with energy. The legacy of Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu is thus a sequence of innovation, consolidation, and stability. Nobunaga broke the old order with fire and steel. Hideyoshi built a new framework with vision and ambition. Ieyasu cemented it into lasting peace. Together, they turned the chaos of the Sengoku into the order of the Edo period. Their efforts reshaped Japan from a land of warring states into a unified nation, whose peace would endure until the arrival of foreign ships centuries later. As we reflect on their lives, we see not only the ambition of great leaders, but also the resilience of the people who lived through their times. Farmers, merchants, artisans, and warriors alike found new rhythms in the wake of unity. The land itself breathed easier, fields growing lush with rice as the fires of war receded. The Unifiers of Japan gave to future generations a legacy of order, laying the foundation upon which the Tokugawa shogunate, and ultimately Emperor Meiji, would build. With the triumph of Tokugawa Ieyasu and the establishment of his shogunate in 1603, Japan entered a new chapter, one not defined by war, but by peace. This Edo period, which lasted for more than 2.5 centuries, is remarkable in world history as one of the longest stretches of domestic stability achieved by any feudal society. The swords of the samurai were not discarded, but their roles shifted profoundly. They became not only warriors, but also administrators, stewards of domains, and guardians of a social hierarchy carefully designed to maintain order. Daily life settled into rhythms of continuity, and in that stillness, Japan developed a unique cultural richness. The Tokugawa shogunate ruled from Edo, the city that would one day become Tokyo. At its heart stood Edo Castle, a sprawling fortress of stone walls, wide moats, and towering gates. Surrounding the castle, neighborhoods grew in concentric patterns, each assigned to different classes. Samurai quarters closest to the center, merchant and artisan districts further out, and temples and shrines dotting the cityscape. The Sankinkotai system, requiring daimyo to alternate their residence between their own domains and Edo, filled the city with processions of retainers and families, creating a vibrant and constantly shifting population. For the samurai class, this system brought both privilege and constraint. They alone were permitted to carry swords, the daisho, pair of long and short blades that symbolized their station. Yet few samurai now fought in open battle. Instead, they served as bureaucrats, accountants, inspectors, and teachers within their domains. Their stipends were paid in rice, a reflection of the agrarian foundation of the economy, but many found it difficult to maintain their status as costs of living rose. Some samurai lived modestly, supplementing their income through teaching or writing, while still holding themselves with the dignity of their class. Life for common people also changed in profound ways. Farmers, bound to their villages, worked the land with stability unknown in the preceding centuries of war. They were the backbone of the economy, their rice harvests feeding not only local domains, but also the swelling cities. Merchants, technically low in the social hierarchy, prospered greatly under the Tokugawa system. Though samurai ranked above them, merchants' control of money and goods gave them a quiet influence. Artisan communities thrived, producing textiles, ceramics, lacquerware, and woodblock prints that became hallmarks of Edo culture. Daily rhythms during the Edo period unfolded with a measured calm. Morning bells rang from temples, signaling the start of the day. Markets opened, offering rice, vegetables, and fish. Samurai in official robes walked purposefully to administrative offices, while children played in the narrow streets of castle towns. In Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka, theaters drew audiences to kabuki plays, with actors portraying historical dramas and tales of love and betrayal. The floating world, ukiyo, of entertainment districts offered escapes into music, art, and companionship, capturing the impermanence and beauty of life. Architecturally, the Edo period gave Japan some of its most enduring landscapes. Castles expanded with multi-tiered keeps rising above towns. Gardens, influenced by Zen ideals, emphasized balance between rocks, water, and carefully pruned trees. Tea houses offered spaces for quiet ritual, where the tea ceremony cultivated discipline and grace. Townhouses, with their wooden facades and paper screens, lined the streets, creating a harmony of form that remains iconic. These built environments reflected not only function, but also a deeply aesthetic sensibility. The long peace also encouraged intellectual growth. Confucianism became a guiding philosophy, reinforcing loyalty, hierarchy, and moral conduct. Samurai were expected to cultivate their minds as well as their martial abilities, studying literature, law, and history. Printing technology spread books more widely, and popular tales reached audiences beyond elite circles. Pilgrimages to shrines and temples continued, blending Shinto and Buddhist practices into the spiritual fabric of everyday life. Yet beneath the calm surface, pressures slowly accumulated. Population growth placed strains on resources, and famines occasionally brought hardship. Samurai, though privileged in status, sometimes faced financial difficulties, as their rice stipends failed to match economic realities. Merchants, officially low-ranked, gained wealth and influence, subtly challenging the rigid social order. These tensions did not erupt into widespread conflict, but they set the stage for future transformation. Still, from the perspective of daily life, the Edo period was one of continuity and predictability. Unlike the tumultuous centuries that had preceded it, generations could live without ever witnessing battle firsthand. A farmer might tend the same fields his grandfather had. A samurai might serve the same domain his father had. And artisans might pass down their crafts through uninterrupted lineages. For many, this was an age of stability that allowed art, culture, and society to flourish like never before. As we let this scene settle, we can picture the streets of Edo at dusk, lanterns glowing softly, merchants closing their shutters, the laughter of children echoing in narrow alleys, and a samurai returning home, his swords at his side, though unused in battle. The peace he inhabits is the gift of Tokugawa governance. A peace that, while fragile against future storms, created a society whose rhythms and traditions carried into the modern age. The Tokugawa era stands as a testament to the ability of a warrior class to reinvent itself, shifting from conquest to stewardship, from swords drawn in battle to scrolls written in quiet halls. It was this world of ordered peace, of layered hierarchy and subtle artistry, that Emperor Meiji would inherit and then transform when the tides of history changed once more. Samurai life in the Edo period was not defined solely by politics or administration. It was equally shaped by culture, philosophy, and aesthetics. In an age when swords were seldom drawn in battle, the warrior class found meaning in cultivating refinement, learning, and artistic pursuits. Out of this blending of martial and cultural values emerged Bushido, the way of the warrior, a philosophy that gave moral direction to a class navigating the long stillness of Tokugawa Peace. Bushido was not a single codified code, but rather a set of ideals that evolved across centuries. At its heart lay loyalty to one's lord, the willingness to sacrifice oneself for duty, and the cultivation of honor in all actions. The samurai were taught that true strength resided not only in skill with the sword, but also in self-discipline, sincerity, and restraint. Zen Buddhism infused Bushido with its emphasis on impermanence and mindfulness, while Confucianism reinforced hierarchy, obedience, and social order. Together, these influences shaped a worldview that balanced steel with spirit. Daily practice of these ideals can be glimpsed in the cultural pursuits that flourished under samurai patronage. The tea ceremony, or chanoyu, became a ritual of harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. Warriors, seated in simple tea huts, shared bowls of powdered green tea while contemplating the stillness of a carefully arranged garden. Every gesture, from the folding of a cloth to the placement of a ladle, was imbued with meaning. In the stillness of tea, samurai cultivated patience and humility, virtues as essential as courage in battle. Poetry, too, occupied an important place in samurai life. Haiku, with its brevity and sensitivity to nature, became a favored form of expression. A warrior might compose a verse before entering battle, or reflect upon the cherry blossoms outside his home, knowing that their fleeting bloom mirrored the transience of human life. These poems, often preserved in diaries and collections, remind us that behind the armor and swords lay hearts attuned to beauty and impermanence. Art and architecture also carried the samurai's touch. Ink paintings, inspired by Chinese landscapes, conveyed vast mountains and rivers with just a few brushstrokes, emphasizing suggestion over detail. Castles, once purely military strongholds, became cultural centers, adorned with golden screens and painted sliding doors that celebrated nature and myth. In gardens, rocks, ponds, and carefully pruned pines offered spaces of reflection, embodying both Zen simplicity and warrior discipline. Even in theater, samurai influence was felt. No drama, with its slow meditative movements and masked performers, appealed to warrior patrons who valued its themes of duty, honor, and the lingering presence of spirits. Later, kabuki theater captured more popular audiences, but many of its tales drew upon samurai history, dramatizing battles, betrayals, and tragic loves. In this way, cultural memory of the warrior class was woven into the very fabric of entertainment. For commoners, the samurai's cultural patronage created opportunities to participate in broader artistic life. Townspeople attended kabuki plays, purchased woodblock prints of famous actors and warriors, and joined in seasonal festivals. Merchants sponsored tea gatherings, sometimes emulating their samurai betters. The cross-pollination of classes through culture softened the rigid boundaries of the hierarchy, allowing art to flow freely even when politics did not. The philosophy of Bushido also shaped conduct in times of crisis. Samurai were taught to confront death with calm acceptance, to regard life as a loan from their lord and their ancestors. This outlook is perhaps most famously expressed in the tale of the 47 Ronin, retainers who avenged their lord's unjust death and then submitted to their own punishment. Their story, retold in plays and prints, became a symbol of loyalty and sacrifice, embodying the Bushido spirit even in an age of peace. Yet we must remember that Bushido, for all its ideals, was lived in the complexities of real life. Some samurai struggled with poverty, turning to teaching, farming, or even banditry to survive. Others clung to ritual displays of honor that could not always match the practical realities of governance. The contrast between ideal and reality gave Bushido both its power and its poignancy, as warriors sought to live up to values that often surpassed the circumstances of their time. As we let this period settle in our minds, we see the samurai not only as figures of steel and authority, but also as poets, tea masters, and patrons of art. Their swords hung by their sides, but their hearts turned often to the fleeting beauty of blossoms, the sound of a temple bell at dusk, or the quiet ripples of a garden pond. In this blending of duty and beauty of Bushido and art, the warrior class found meaning during the long stillness of Edo peace. As the Edo period unfolded, its long stillness was eventually unsettled by the faint but growing presence of distant shores. For more than 2 centuries, Japan had followed a policy known as sakoku, or closed country, which restricted contact with the outside world. Foreign trade was tightly controlled, limited primarily to Dutch and Chinese merchants at Nagasaki's artificial island of Dejima. Christianity, once spread by European missionaries in the Sengoku age, was suppressed, and foreign influence was kept at bay. Yet despite this seclusion, whispers of a wider world reached Japan's shores, and in time, the shadows of the West grew too long to ignore. Daily life during the early years of sakoku remained focused inward. Farmers tilled their fields, artisans honed their crafts, and merchants carried rice and goods along coastal routes. For most people, the outside world was little more than rumor. Yet even within the boundaries of isolation, limited exchanges enriched Japanese knowledge. The Dutch, though confined to their island outpost, brought books and instruments that introduced Western science, medicine, and astronomy. This body of study, called Rangaku or Dutch learning, was pursued by curious scholars who translated foreign texts, dissected human anatomy, and traced celestial patterns. Thus, even in seclusion, Japan was not entirely cut off from the intellectual currents beyond its borders, but the wider world was changing rapidly. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Western powers expanded across seas with ships of iron and cannons of steel. Their navies patrolled oceans, seeking new markets and ports. For Japan, the decisive encounter came in 1853, when American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay with his Black Ships. steam-powered vessels bristling with guns. Their sudden appearance, black smoke curling into the sky, startled those who saw them, and their presence made clear that Japan's long seclusion could not endure forever. The samurai, who for centuries had defined themselves through sword and code, faced a new and disquieting reality. Their daisho blades, symbols of honor, were powerless against iron hulls and modern artillery. Domain lords debated how to respond, torn between preserving tradition and recognizing the necessity of adaptation. Some advocated cautious openness, others pressed for resistance, and still others sought to blend Western technology with Japanese spirit. The arrival of Perry's ships was not only a diplomatic crisis, it was an existential question for the samurai order itself. For ordinary people, the changes were gradual but unsettling. Coastal towns saw unfamiliar faces, strange goods, and the hum of new technologies. Rumors of foreign intentions circulated in marketplaces and tea houses. Anxiety mingled with curiosity. The outside world promised both danger and opportunity. Meanwhile, in castle halls, daimyo and advisors weighed the future, aware that centuries of Tokugawa stability trembled under the pressure of foreign demand. The shogunate, long the guardian of order, found itself in an impossible position. Signing treaties with Western powers seemed humiliating, yet refusal risked destruction by superior firepower. As unequal treaties were imposed, granting foreign merchants extraterritorial rights and access to ports, discontent spread among both samurai and commoners. The very legitimacy of the shogunate came under question, as many argued that only the emperor, long sidelined in Kyoto, could rally the nation in the face of foreign threat. Thus, the encroachment of Western ships stirred not only diplomacy, but also the reawakening of imperial authority. In this twilight of the Tokugawa era, samurai loyalty grew strained. Some rallied to the slogan Sono Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Others saw that resistance alone would bring ruin and sought to adapt Japan to Western technology. Internal conflicts flared as domains such as Choshu and Satsuma defied the shogunate, aligning themselves with the cause of imperial restoration. Sword met musket in small but telling clashes, signaling the beginning of the end for the old order. Yet even as the old ways faltered, daily life continued with remarkable resilience. Farmers still harvested rice, children still studied in temple schools, and merchants still sold their wares. But beneath this continuity lay an undercurrent of change. Foreign books circulated more widely, young samurai learned foreign languages, and new ideas about government and industry took root. The Western shadows lengthened across Japan, touching every stratum of society, even as many clung to the traditions that had shaped their lives for generations. As we let this scene settle in our thoughts, we find ourselves at the threshold of transformation. The calm order of Tokugawa Japan, crafted by centuries of warrior governance, now faced challenges it could not resolve with swords or codes alone. The samurai predecessors of Emperor Meiji stood at a crossroads, their legacy of discipline and loyalty tested by the winds of global change. In the next chapter, we will reflect on how this long inheritance of samurai values shaped the emperor's modern era, and how centuries of tradition found both continuity and rupture in the dawn of a new age. The long centuries of samurai rule did not simply vanish when Emperor Meiji came to the throne in 1867. Instead, their legacy, shaped through generations of warriors, administrators, poets, and patrons, was carried into the modern age. To understand Meiji's transformation of Japan into a modern state, we must look at how the traditions of the samurai both guided and constrained his world. Their values, institutions, and even their struggles became the foundation upon which he built a new nation. When Meiji assumed the throne, Japan was at a critical juncture. Western powers pressed at the country's doors, demanding trade and diplomatic recognition. The Tokugawa shogunate, weakened by internal division and unequal treaties, could no longer command unquestioned loyalty. Into this crisis stepped the emperor, long revered but largely ceremonial during centuries of warrior governance. Now, supported by reformist samurai from powerful domains like Choshu and Satsuma, Meiji embodied a return of authority to the throne. Yet this was not simply a restoration of ancient rule. It was the creation of something new, forged from both tradition and modern necessity. The samurai heritage shaped Meiji's reforms in profound ways. The ideals of Bushido, loyalty, discipline, sacrifice, were repurposed as moral pillars for the new state. Samurai loyalty, once directed toward daimyo and shoguns, was redirected toward the emperor and the nation. The education of samurai, steeped in Confucian classics and military history, provided a generation of leaders who now became administrators, soldiers, and statesmen in the modern bureaucracy. Even the strict social hierarchy of the Tokugawa era, though dismantled, left behind habits of order and duty that informed the Meiji government's approach to modernization. Daily life, however, changed rapidly. The samurai class, once supported by rice stipends, found their privileges abolished. The wearing of swords in public was banned, a symbolic end to centuries of warrior identity. Many former samurai struggled, some falling into poverty, others turning to new roles as teachers, policemen, or entrepreneurs. Yet their ethos did not disappear. It was woven into the new army, which adopted modern weapons but retained the language of loyalty and sacrifice. Former samurai became officers, training conscripted peasants in both modern drills and the moral code of service. Thus, the spirit of the sword lived on, even as the sword itself was laid aside. For the common people, the Meiji reforms brought opportunities and disruptions alike. Farmers faced new taxes in cash rather than rice, tying them more closely to markets. Merchants, once considered low in status, rose to prominence in a modernizing economy. Artisans adapted their crafts to new technologies, while urban life expanded in cities linked by railroads and telegraphs. Yet through all these shifts, the memory of samurai governance lingered. Villages still spoke of the lords who had once ruled them, and families still preserved tales of ancestors who had fought in the Sengoku or served in Edo's quiet halls. Culturally, the samurai legacy continued to shape identity. Literature and theater romanticized their deeds, with plays and novels retelling the exploits of Yoshitsune, the loyalty of the 47 Ronin, and the boldness of Nobunaga. These stories became part of Japan's modern imagination, teaching new generations to admire the virtues of courage and loyalty, even in an industrial age. Woodblock prints depicted both samurai heroes of the past and the new soldiers of Meiji's army, blending old and new imagery. The line between tradition and innovation blurred, creating a continuity that made rapid change less disorienting. Yet not all was harmony. Discontent simmered among dispossessed samurai who felt their status had been erased. This resentment erupted in uprisings, most famously the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, a former Meiji supporter turned critic. In this tragic conflict, samurai armed with swords and old ideals faced modern conscripts with rifles and artillery. Their defeat marked the true end of the samurai as a class, yet even in loss, their courage and loyalty became celebrated as national virtues. Saigo himself was later romanticized as the last true samurai, his rebellion seen not as failure, but as testament to enduring spirit. The legacy of the samurai predecessors of Emperor Meiji thus unfolds on multiple levels. Institutionally, they provided the structures of governance, the habits of discipline, and the networks of leadership that eased Japan's rapid modernization. Culturally, they left behind stories, philosophies, and aesthetics that gave moral meaning to the new age. Spiritually, they offered a code of loyalty and sacrifice that could be redirected toward nationhood. Even in their dissolution as a social class, they shaped the very identity of modern Japan. As we reflect on this long journey, from the mounted archers of the Heian fields to the warlords of the Sengoku, to the bureaucrats of Edo, and finally to the reformers and rebels of Meiji's dawn, we see how history flows not in abrupt ruptures, but in layered continuities. The samurai were never only warriors. They were guardians of culture, stewards of land, and keepers of ideals. Their predecessors laid the foundation upon which Meiji could both dismantle and rebuild, carrying forward what was valuable while reshaping what was no longer sufficient. Tonight, as we let this story come to rest, we can imagine the quiet twilight of the Edo period giving way to the bright but uncertain morning of Meiji. The swords may be sheathed, the castles repurposed, the codes rewritten, but the presence of the samurai endures in memory, in culture, and in the very fabric of Japan's modern identity. Their legacy is not a relic of the past, but a living current that continues to ripple through the present.